Ethan entered the room with a confident smile on his face, casually tossing his sunglasses onto the coffee table. He felt incredibly comfortable in his perfectly tailored suit and impeccable shoes, exuding that air of superiority I knew so well. Beside him were suitcases proudly displaying the logos of the most expensive brands. First class to Europe, five-star hotels. That's the life I've missed, Madison, he announced with a sparkle in his eye. I couldn't help it. A short but genuine laugh escaped my lips. His face immediately darkened with irritation. What's so funny? He asked. Oh, Ethan. I shook my head with a cynical smile on my lips. You have no idea what you've just done. Now, dear listeners, let me introduce myself. My name is Madison. I'm 32 years old, and I work in cybersecurity. For 6 years, I was married to Ethan, a man who hid a rather dubious character behind a charming facade. He was always a dreamer, a great orator, someone who made grand promises and built grand plans. I, on the other hand, was the one who brought those plans to life. While he jumped from one crazy idea to another, fueled by hopes and his convincing speeches, I supported our home with my stable career. The warning signs were always there. Constant excuses about the lack of money, financial secrets, gaps he never really explained. But out of stubbornness or love, I preferred to believe we were building something together. A home, a family. Until everything fell apart last week. It happened in the dead of night around 2 o'clock. I was sleeping upstairs, completely unaware that Ethan was making a mistake his eloquence could no longer fix. He waited until I fell asleep and took my laptop. As a cybersecurity specialist, I'm trained to recognize fraud and hacks, but I never thought I'd have to use these skills in my own home. That night, Ethan used my computer to access the data of one of my credit cards. He copied the information, took photos with his phone, and without batting an eye, returned to bed as if nothing had happened. The next morning, while I was drinking coffee, my phone literally exploded with notifications. Something was wrong. Opening the banking app, I immediately saw the evidence. Almost $60,000 spent on designer clothes, expensive watches, and a first-class ticket to Paris. I caught my breath. The puzzle quickly came together. Of course, it was Ethan, but instead of panicking, I smiled. He had fallen into his own trap. The card he used wasn't my personal one, so it was a dummy credit card linked to a training program I run at work. It exists to teach companies how to detect and prevent fraud. Every transaction Ethan made triggered automatic alerts, and there I was, with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the notifications on my phone. For the first time in years, I felt in control. This was the beginning of the end for Ethan, and he had no idea. This case was immediately going to the authorities, and Ethan didn't even realize he had just become the perfect training example. That same morning, I called my lawyer, Julia. You won't believe what happened, I began, telling her all the details. On the other end of the line, Julia couldn't help but laugh. Wait, let me get this straight, she said, still laughing. Your husband tried to steal money from a fake card, the very card that's linked to a fraud detection program? Exactly, I replied with a satisfied smile. He thought he was being clever, but he didn't even understand what he was doing. Clever? He's a real criminal genius, Julia joked. Every purchase he makes is tracked. Have the authorities contacted you yet? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. The rest of the week, I remained calm, watching from the sidelines to see how far Ethan would go. A few days later, I found a note on the kitchen counter. I need some time for myself, don't wait up. I immediately knew what that meant. He was spending the stolen money to live his dream life, or rather my nightmares somewhere abroad. Every night, I tracked the fraudulent transaction notifications on my phone. Luxury restaurants, five-star hotels, expensive purchases. Each notification was a small victory. 3 days into a spree, I received a call from Agent Adam, a federal investigator assigned to the case. We've identified a series of suspicious transactions linked to your account, he explained. Do you know who might be behind this? Yes, I answered without hesitation. It's my husband. There was a brief pause on the line before he asked in surprise, Your husband? I explained the entire situation, including the fact that the card was part of a cybersecurity training program. On the other end of the line, I heard a quiet whistle of admiration. "I've never seen anything like this," he said. "You'll need to give an official statement." But based on what we've already found, he's in serious trouble. I patiently waited for the moment when Ethan would return, and when he finally did, it seemed as if nothing had happened. He entered the living room with the confidence of a man who had just conquered the world, dressed in expensive clothes and with suitcases adorned with luxury brand logos. "Thanks for the upgrade," he said with a smug smile. "This time you really outdid yourself." I couldn't help but laugh. He stopped frowning, clearly expecting me to be furious. "What's so funny?" he asked irritably. "Oh, Ethan," I replied, shaking my head. "You'll find out soon enough." Dropping his branded backpack on the floor, he took off his custom jacket and casually draped it over the back of the couch. "Seriously, Madison, you should have told me about this card a long time ago. Imagine how we could have enjoyed it together." I leaned against the kitchen table, arms crossed. "And how exactly did you think this would end?" He laughed and kicked off his expensive shoes. "You've always been so strict with money. It's not like you couldn't afford it. I thought that seeing how happy it made me, you'd turn a blind eye." His audacity was almost comical if it weren't so pathetic. I smiled calmly, letting him continue talking. Every word he said was another nail in his own coffin. "So, the watches, the flights, the hotels, you thought these were my gifts?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Of course," he replied, pointing to himself. "It's time for you to relax and enjoy all the pleasures of life." When he went to the bathroom, humming some off-key tune, I took my phone and sent a message to Julia. "He's back, ready to move forward." The response came instantly. "Great," I'll inform Agent Adam. Throughout that week, Julia and Adam worked diligently on the case against Ethan. Every transaction was tracked, every purchase meticulously documented. From luxury clothing boutiques to fancy hotels in Paris, his spending painted a portrait of a man who thought he was invincible. Adam assured me that the fraud alerts linked to the dummy card had already triggered a full-scale investigation. "We'll call him in for questioning as soon as you give the signal," he said. The more confident he is in his impunity, the better. And there he was, singing in the shower as if he didn't have a care in the world. And I felt an incredible sense of calm. For years, I had allowed Ethan to take advantage of my trust, patience, and financial stability. But now he would finally face the consequences of underestimating me. When he emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a fluffy towel and with a smug smile as if he owned the world, all I could do was smile back. He had no idea what was coming. He flopped onto the couch with a triumphant look, as if he were the hero of a great achievement. "You should have seen Paris," he exclaimed, rummaging through his bag until he pulled out a shiny gold watch. The shops, the restaurants, it was like a dream. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, pretending to be interested. "Sounds amazing. Tell me more." He began to detail his week of luxury, filled with theatrical gestures and unnecessary comments, like the quality of champagne at some elite rooftop bar. Every word he said sounded like a confession, but he didn't even notice. I listened intently, while my phone, hidden in my apron pocket, recorded every detail of this performance. The recording would soon be sent to Agent Adam. "And you know what the best part was?" he said, spinning the watch on his wrist to admire it. "No one suspected a thing. Not even you." The next morning, I met with Julia at a cafe to discuss the final details. She scrolled through the evidence on her tablet with a satisfied smile. "He doesn't stand a chance," she said, pointing to the screens with records of fraud, luxury purchases, and of course, the recording from last night. "It's all wrapped up. Adam is already coordinating with the local police for the arrest." I nodded, feeling the full weight of the situation finally hit me. "What happens next?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He'll be charged with fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized use of financial accounts. Given the amount, the consequences will be severe. At best, he'll reach a plea deal. At worst, Ethan could spend years in prison." For a moment, I tried to feel sorry for him, but then I remembered his smug smile as he showed off his trophies. This wasn't just a one-time mistake, but a pattern of selfishness I had endured for too long. Later that night, Ethan was lying on the couch, engrossed in his phone, when I heard a decisive knock on the door. My heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. I walked to the door and opening it, saw Agent Adam and two uniformed police officers. "Good evening, Miss Madison," Adam said with a professional but polite tone. "Is Ethan home?" "Yes, he's here." I stepped aside to let them in. "Make yourselves at home." Ethan looked up from his phone, frowning in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, settling back on the couch. Adam approached with the confident authority of someone who already had full control of the situation. "Ethan Anderson, you are under investigation for multiple counts of fraud and unauthorized use of financial accounts. We need you to come with us for questioning." Ethan's face turned pale, and all his confidence vanished in seconds. "No, this must be a mistake," he stammered, looking helplessly at me. "Madison, tell them this is crazy." I crossed my arms and tilted my head slightly. "I don't know, Ethan. You've been so busy lately, maybe you should explain it to them yourself." As the police began to read him his rights, Ethan stood up, protesting. "You can't do this, Madison. This is a setup. You're my wife. You're not supposed to be against me." I laughed dryly and leaned against the door. "Funny, Ethan. I thought husbands weren't supposed to steal from their wives. I guess we're both learning lessons today." His bravado crumbled, giving way to desperation. "You won't get away with this," he shouted as they let him out. "Oh, Ethan," I whispered, closing the door with a loud click. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the empty space where he had been just minutes ago. My heart was racing, not with fear, but with the feeling that I was finally free. He was gone for good. About an hour later, Julia called me. "They've started the interrogation," she said in a calm but determined voice. "According to Adam, Ethan is already trying to manipulate the story." I rolled my eyes. "Of course he is. Let me guess. He's making himself the victim." "Exactly," Julia replied, stifling a dry laugh. "He's claiming you gave him permission to use the card, but don't worry. With all the fraud alerts, tracked purchases, and your recording, he doesn't stand a chance." The next morning, Agent Adam called me again. "We have everything we need," he reported. "Your husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, admitted to using the card but now claims he didn't know it was part of a fraud detection program. He's trying to shift the blame onto you out of confusion." "That sounds like him," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "What's next?" "We'll proceed with the charges," Adam explained. "He'll face multiple counts, and given the amount, the consequences will be severe." "Oh, and about the luxury purchases. The buyer protection programs have already reimbursed those transactions. You won't be liable for anything." Relief washed over me, almost overwhelming. I had finally closed this chapter of my life, confident that Ethan would face the consequences of his actions. For nights, I had carried the weight of Ethan's actions, fearing he might escape punishment by finding loopholes in the system. But hearing the certainty in Adam's voice, I fully realized the extent of my victory. "Thank you for everything," I said sincerely. "Don't thank me," Adam replied with a slight smile. "This case practically solved itself. You handled it brilliantly." Ethan's downfall was swifter and more devastating than I had anticipated. News of his arrest spread like wildfire among our acquaintances. The facade of the charming and carefree husband crumbled within days. Daria, the woman I had always suspected might be involved with him, left him without hesitation upon learning of the charges. His luxury items were confiscated, flights canceled, and bank accounts frozen. He was alone and cornered. One night my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Madison!" The raspy voice on the other end revealed his identity. "I need to talk to you." I couldn't help but laugh dryly. "Ethan, the only thing you need to do is explain yourself to the court." He tried to insist, his tone wavering between desperation and excuses. "I made a mistake, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was just—" "Just what?" I interrupted. My voice was cold as ice. "Just trying to deceive me? Just hoping I'd be blind or too patient to notice?" A long pause before he whispered, "I thought you loved me." I sighed heavily, feeling my anger boil over. "I did love you, Ethan, the person I thought you were. But the man who lied, stole, and tried to use me, I could never love him." Before he could respond, I hung up. A week later, Julia called me with news. He's agreed to a plea deal. He won't go to prison, but he'll have to repay every cent and do community service. Plus, his credit will be ruined for years. Sounds fair, I replied with a slight smile. He always wanted to live well. Now he'll understand what it's like to live on the other side. Julia laughed. You're handling this much better than most people. I thought for a moment and said, almost surprised by my own words. For years, I thought Ethan was the one holding our marriage together. I thought his charm, ambition, and big ideas were what drove us. But now I see clearly. I was the one holding everything on my shoulders. When the divorce papers came, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat on the couch, and looked around the apartment. Without Ethan, the space felt lighter, as if the weight of his betrayal had finally been lifted. His absence wasn't a loss, but a gift, a chance to rebuild my life without the constant shadow of his selfishness. For the first time in many years, I felt truly free. In the days that followed, the silence in the apartment was almost eerie, but also comforting. Julia came over to help me with the final paperwork, her usual practicality in tow. How are you? She asked, sitting down on the couch. Better than I expected, I admitted, handing her a cup of coffee. It's strange, but I don't feel anger, just relief. She smiled understandingly. Because you won, Madison. You didn't just survive this. You became stronger. As we reviewed the documents, I realized that the financial restitution from Ethan was just a small part of it. The most important thing was that I had finally gained my independence. For years, I had accepted unfair conditions in our relationship, thinking it was better to avoid conflict. But now I understood that a peace built on silence and concessions wasn't real peace. A week later, the official divorce letter arrived in a modest envelope, too small for something so significant. I held it for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in before opening it. There were the words that mattered, finalized and irrevocable. I sat at the kitchen table, holding the letter in my hands, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The life I had envisioned when I married Ethan, stability, partnership, mutual trust, had never existed. But looking around at the space I now called my own, I realized I had something far more valuable: freedom, clarity, and the confidence that I was stronger than I had ever thought. And in that moment, as the silence of the apartment filled the air, I toasted to myself, not to the end of a marriage, but to the beginning of a new life. In the following weeks, I finally took the vacation I had long dreamed of. I went to the beach, enjoying the quiet that comes only when you leave everything behind. Ethan tried to contact me several times, sending messages through mutual acquaintances, vague apologies via email, and even a letter full of promises of change that sounded almost comical. I didn't respond. There was nothing left worth saying. He made his choice, and I made mine. Occasionally, I heard rumors about his life. They said he was trying to find work, and his reputation was ruined by the fraud charges. He had moved back in with his parents and still seemed convinced that everything could be fixed with just words. I didn't feel sorry for him. In fact, I felt relieved that he was no longer my problem. A month later, after everything was finalized, Julie and I met for brunch, a small ritual since Ethan had left my life. Between conversations, she asked, "So what's next? What are your plans?" I smiled, feeling a mix of peace and excitement I hadn't felt in a long time. Honestly, I'm focusing on myself. Work is going well, and I'm thinking of taking a long vacation. Maybe going somewhere quiet, like the mountains. Julia raised her glass and said with a smile, "That's what I like to hear. You deserve it." For the first time in years, I felt like I was making decisions for myself, without compromises, without hidden agendas, just the freedom to live by my own rules. Sometimes I heard about Ethan through mutual acquaintances. He continued trying to rebuild his life, moving from one poorly paid job to another, trying to pay off his debts. His expensive suits and luxury trips had been replaced by a harsh reality he was clearly unprepared for. The last I heard of him was through an email, a long and melodramatic apology that sounded more like self-pity than genuine remorse. I read a few lines before deleting it without a response. I didn't need closure from him. I had already found it within myself. One evening, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights in the distance. I thought about everything I had been through: the betrayal, the heartbreak, the fight for what was mine. All those struggles had led me here. And while it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. There was no more anger or resentment, only gratitude. Ethan's betrayal had forced me to look at my own strength, to stop settling for less, and to put my happiness first. I had learned to trust my instincts, to value my independence, and to never again let anyone control my life. I raised my glass to toast under the starry sky, a toast to myself, a toast to new beginnings, and with that, I finally closed the chapter on Ethan. I was ready to embrace whatever the future held with a light heart and the confidence that the best part of my life was just beginning.